economics, apart from economic methodologists or philosophers of economics, we don't really deal seriously enough with question of ethics and moral. A view of society or to understanding of society that's based on maximization of profit, maximization of utility driven by self-interest is certainly problematic. And it's likely to be inconsistent with finite resources or the climate change concerns. We should be concerned about different narratives about what's happening in society, different narratives about who we are. This should be kind of prerequisites for any researchers. No, there is no one truth. There are many, and you need to deal with that. I think the pandemic has really exacerbated some of the contradictions that are inherent to capitalism, and it would be nice to start addressing these contradictions and then have a serious discussion with all the cards on the table about what we're going to do next. We're going to destroy the planet. We're going to live with inequality, with people not having anything to eat, with kids, with children dying of malnutrition. Is that how we want to carry on? Yes, okay, why does economic matters? Well, I'm just gonna take us a little bit back on the definition of the discipline itself, because I think that helps us to understand why it's important. So economics is this area of study, is a discipline that emerged when moral philosophers or historians, they're kind of concerned about how we live, about our production, about our consumption, how we organizing all this, the necessary structure for our lives. And if we go back to the Arabic scholar in the 14th century called Ibn, I don't know how to pronounce his name properly, Ibn Khaldun, he's the first scholar or the first thinker that is kind of, you can say that it was establishing what we call economics, because he's basically trying to understand, or he's saying that, okay, we should have a way to investigate human social organization. And it's interesting because he said, in order to do that, we should have this kind of a sound yardstick helping us to analyze society. So, with this in mind, with this idea, is how economics becomes important, because it's about basically is about our life. And there are, despite different ways to put it, I would say that I have no doubt that every single economist would agree with that, and he would probably say as well that economics is about improving the material conditions of society. So our goal as economists is to use the knowledge, the tool, the training we have to trying to achieve some good. Let's just, say in that way. Obviously, the issue is, to have agreement on the kind of tools and training that is ideal for that, and also agreement on what that good is. So there were some issues there, but overall, yes, economics does matter. We like it or not, economics is, has its objective of analyzing the society, the economy. We try, as economists, we try to elaborate policy to improve society. We know that the economist profession has a huge influence nowadays, and economists, they are demanded for almost every area of policy, and as well as in the private sector. So yeah, it's a very important discipline. I think that I'm probably gonna have a long answer for this. Let me start with academic economics first. So academic economics has a very interesting framework, because we try to analyze a phenomena with the help of mathematical deductions, or laws or uniformities, right? So this is our, let's say, our tools in our framework. And here the market is the economy, and society is understood through the lenses of market. Another aspect here is that all the market, all the market process, they ought to have a certain objectivity, a certain regularity, so that change in the market can be, let's say, traceable and can show uniformity. And then, so, this market is not really subject to, let's say, arbitrary caprice, for example. And this is a kind of scientificity that economists they're looking for. And when they're heading to have this kind of framework, we argue that we are looking into things as they are, but we're not really looking at things and how things should be. And that's the question of objectivity here, attempt of achieving a certain idea of truth. So obviously, obviously there are you know many problems with this approach. If anything, for example, as social scientists, we know that an idea of truth, an idea of objectivity is basically, an achievable goal in our field. But I think the most important point here uh, is to highlight how this market field can be very problematic for practitioners and policymakers, because we make their lives very difficult, very difficult. When we sacrifice this realism, when you have this kind of we have a framework that sacrifices this realism, we kind of stop ourselves to understand that economic situations, they are unique, right? They have a kind of a very unique way of being that is stop this idea of having a tractable or a generalization about certain events or certain economic events. So when economists, when they accept this sacrifice of realism, let's say, we set ourselves then the task to keep looking to what's the exception in our framework, right? So we keep like, what are cases that are somehow departing from the norm, and that norm is what give all this, entire coherence to our framework. And why this makes life of practitioners and policymakers very difficult, because basically we have two options here. One is we keep testing, economists, they keep testing a range of hypotheses, right, to trying to cover the complexity of society, which is time consuming. Of course, you can say, now we have computers and etc., but it's still problematic. And the other option is economists, they try to safely place all these disturbing factors in economy in this kind of, let's say, a prison of ceteris paribus. So everything remaining equal. So the both options, to keep trying to this hypothesis to kind of grasp the complexity of society, always deviating from the norm, or this prison of the ceteris paribus is a problem for policymakers, is a problem for, let's say, practitioners. So this is the academic economics, and as you can see, there are problems here. So what happened is economic engineering, in a way, is much more pragmatic, right? They want to get things done, let's say, like this, and in that case, they are trying. Economic engineering actually emerged as a field where engineers they are trying to look for knowledge of economics to inform their decision, so they would be able to have a better decision, to be more efficient. So they want to solve problems, and they want to apply economic principle to solve these problems. And this sounds very right, very interesting, very cool, but we have to be very careful, because economic principles that this kind of economic engineering is relying, they are very much linked to that market logic I just described above, right? With all the weaknesses and shortcomings I also mentioned. So for some decision-making process, fine, this may work, especially if you're looking at private sector, if you're looking at costs, depreciation, risk, and so on. This is actually an interesting framework. However, if you're looking at, thinking in terms of the economy more broadly, or even if you're looking at the policy making from the perspective of central banks or the state itself, I'm very skeptical about this approach. And we know since the 1970s in UK or Europe, probably 80s. If you go to regions such as Latin America, probably the 90s, we know that we have this turn in policy towards market precepts and axioms that have influenced the way policymakers are acting, which is what we call the new public management paradigm in public policy, which brings the reliance on market mechanisms and even the question of the rational choice theory. So what happens there with this influence of the new public management, which is related a little bit to this economic engineering, the way I see, is that we have what we are facing nowadays is conflict between, efficiency versus resiliency. Because on one side, all these market precepts, these axioms leading us to a concept of, economic system that's largely orientated towards profit making, cost minimization. But on the other side, for example, we're going to have poor monetary remuneration of essential workers, for example, such as nurses, or we're going to have a kind of just-in-time or lean work, as they call procedures that kind of justify systematic underinvestment in planning and in state capacity, which, by the way, has impaired our capacity to deal with the pandemic right now. So I think we should be very careful with how we approach the economy itself. One thing is the private sector is some kind of a more pragmatic way to deal with that. Then another thing is the economy more broadly, and that's why I'm very skeptical about this kind of this economic engineering. I think here as well is about something I mentioned before, the question of what is that good that economists are trying to achieve. Because in economics, apart from economic methodologists or philosophers of economics, we don't really deal seriously enough with question of ethics and moral. So we really don't know what are we don't have, let's say, a code, a moral code that can guide the way we're doing economics, right? But it's interesting because at the same time we don't have this, let's say, ethical code, we have a kind of assessment, a judgment that we are looking to a behavior that's assumed to be the rational or the commendable. And this kind of behavior indicates efforts that are directed to no other goal than the equilibrium within this market, right? So in this economic theory that's based on certain assumptions, the interaction between supply, demand, and the context of scarcity. So in a way, we do have an implicit kind of economic norm, but we don't discuss it. And so there is a conflict there. So I think in my view, the difference is not much about economic engineering or academic economics, but it's about how economists, they can deal with concerns, not so, let's say, pragmatic, but sometimes concerns regarding human fears and hopes and desires and needs and loves and lives, things that are not very easy to be quantified, but they're very important. And in that context as well, I think the important question is a kind of framework that allow us to include these concerns, but also to move a little bit away from understanding of the economy just as market environment. Perhaps there is something else there that doesn't need to go through the market. Sorry, that was a long answer, but that's how I see. Wow. Yeah. Well, I think somehow I've been touching some of these points before. I think, yeah, I do think the role of economics and the role of economists is to trying to achieve this good, and that's why we need to discuss what that good is. But I think I wanted to bring into that discussion economist, a female economist that is actually very under-recognized. Not, she was a brilliant economist in the 1930s, but we don't study her and her ideas as much as we should. In fact, she was, she played an important role theorizing the welfare state in England, in the UK, together with Keynes and William Beveridge, but we don't really get to listen to her about her ideas very much. So her name is Barbara Wootton, and she's writing in the 1930s. And I like that she stated very clear that economics should be useful, it should be concerned with social betterment. Right? So of course, the social betterment, she's going to discuss this concern with social betterment is difficult because it's beyond the intellectual argument, and it depends on value, it depends on moral, and depends on beliefs. But she's very clear that economics should not be undertaken in a spirit of indifference regarding its practical utility as a means of improving conditions of human life. That you have to have that goal. So her ideas are very interesting in that sense. She's very clear that the purpose of economics is to assist, this kind of solving, in terms of solving social problems. And I like there's a phrase she uses, and I'm going to try to paraphrase here, because she said, if just think properly, if anything of substantial utility is to come out of economists' work, this economy should be allowed to poke her noses into questions of the quality of social aims and the quality of means by which these aims are formulated. So it's a very interesting way. It seems obvious, but we economists right now, our framework is so concerned about choices within the market and the question of price, and our interaction is just through prices, that we don't realize how actually what she's saying here is how important it is that we need to focus on this social betterment. Yeah, I hope, have I missed? There was a second part, right? What's the second part of that question?
What does it serve the common good?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I think to just put together some points I made before, is debatable if it is serving the common good or not. As you know, there is this contrast, in my view, between this efficiency, this focus on market, and something else that I'm not sure economists are discussing as much as they should, regarding a system of provision, for example, regarding a society that has capacity to deal with situations such as a pandemic, with a robust welfare state, a robust public health system, and also, I guess a framework that that challenge a little bit how we understand, for example, remuneration of workers. You can see, again, with this pandemic, workers that are key for our society, that are in the front line, they are the ones very often that are not, they're poorly paid. So, which kind of economic theory we are having here to be in that situation right now. So I have, so I think we do need to rethink if economics is actually look into this common good, or if it's providing enough ideas, enough insights for us. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I have thought about, but yeah, I think you follow from everything I've been saying. In a way, I think in the short, right, a short answer for that is a view of society, or to understanding of society that's based on maximization of profit, maximization of utility, driven by self-interest, is certainly problematic, and it's likely to be inconsistent with finite resources or the climate change concerns. But I think we can expand this question in 2 points. The first one is, and again, I'm gonna go back to our framework and the question of how economic analysis, the kind of framework that economic analysis relies on, because the first point is economics is not mainly empirical science, and we should be very concerned about how economists use empirical evidence to support the theory. So what I mean here is that our current economic theory has a very limited view about what the economy is, right, what society is. So economists, they need to be capable of seeing the economy as more than just markets. The economy is embedded in society, and therefore our profession should stop treating the economy as a separate entity and should start situating the economy within broader issues such as, nature, environment, ethics, as I mentioned before, empowering, etc. So just to exemplify that, to make it a little bit more concrete, if you look again to bring the pandemic to bring the discussion around the pandemic again, economists, they are seeing this pandemic as this external shock, right? This external shock, and this is in itself revealing because it kind of shows how. Oh, sorry, that's my phone. Apologies. And that shows is a reflection of their view of the economy as a separate from the rest of society. So the external aspect, this external shock, the pandemic, is in line with the view of externality in economics, which are conceived ahistorically. The historical context just dropped. And so all this externality is a result of a technological or institutional problem or any other problem that's just stopping, markets from functioning effectively, right? So within this framework, it doesn't really matter how much my profession or myself as economist, how much we care about the environment, about nature, because my methods, my methodology is almost a straitjacket for my analysis in a way, because I'm not really having in the center of my analysis the question of an environment. So economists, they need to forge a better link between economic and economic as a discipline in the social that is not really so far-fetched really in a way it's now. And I think what I mean here is that the economic principles we have in our theory cannot just be applied in social sphere in different problems. When you have a problem of ethic, let's have economic principles here with this market logic. When you look at the state, let's again bring the axioms of market. Again, environment, let's just see how the market principles can guide us here. I think this is complicated. If we situate the economy in society in a much broader way, for example, and there are economists that are trying to do that, but they're a little bit, they're excluded voice in the profession. So if you have that, you can emphasize, for example, that capitalist production is entwined with nature, cannot be separated. So we're going to really discuss the question of limited resources, the question of exploitation of nature, and degradation of nature. So, in this case, if you have this broader concept, economists, they would be able to properly assess, for example, these finite resources and ecological limits of our planet, which is not the same than adding a price tag in every kind of environment issue we have. So, for example, with this broader understanding, there are food system researchers and ecological economists that can send the references afterwards that they've been exploring how production affects food and ecological system. And for these authors, right, the pandemic wasn't expected. They didn't see the pandemic as an external shock. Wasn't a surprise. Wasn't something that their theory wasn't considering. Quite the opposite. But we're not listening to these economists that are a little bit in the margin voice, or social scientists that were theorizing things in that way. So that's the first problem. Sorry, it was a bit too long here, is how we conceptualize society. And again, a critique to how we are stuck in this view of market and equilibrium and so on. The second point, and this is, I guess, more in the macroeconomic kind of realm in economics. So I see that in economics, we're trying to compartmentalize everything, right? So like little pieces of our analysis, but when we're trying to bring them together, they don't really fit so well. It's not this kind of idea, if you bring all the different theories, you have this totality, this analysis that can see the entire system. Quite the opposite, you have gaps in between these theories, and sometimes they're actually incompatible. And a good example of this is when you look at macroeconomists having in one side this business cycle theory, right, where we go back to Luca and so on, we're looking at a kind of fluctuation due to random shocks, the question of technological change, and so on. And then on the other side, we have theories of economic growth, where we are looking to inputs such as productivity of labor, energy, resources. Here's where GDP can come in as well. So I have this true kind of branch of economics, which sometimes can be seen something like short-term analysis and long-term analysis, and they don't come together. And the environment here is totally lost as well, right? So we don't really, we're not discussing, for example, how business cycle theory could help to improve growth in the long run. We don't bring them together to discuss the question of environment, the question of these resources. And this in itself is problematic, because when you're trying to bring these two theories together, there is still limitation. This limitation impact how we understand the environment and the resources we rely on to understand development and economic growth. So the way I see here is that, and again, is a theoretical and a methodological critique in a way, is that we don't have in the center of our analysis the question of, for example, the issue of overconsumption in these models, in both strands of theory, or the issue of global warming, or the issue of the limits of the natural resources. And if you have, is this model that's exception. Again, is this deviating from the norm that I mentioned before. And equally important issue here is that we don't have in that analysis, for example, the question of the difference between countries and how, and the implications that some that destructive colonial legacies will have in that context of when you're thinking of a Green New Deal, for example, for developing countries. At that point here, then just mention a Brazilian economist called Celso Furtado, that he was writing in 1973 in his book, The Myth of Development. And I think, in my view, to the best of my knowledge, obviously, he was the first economist that is looking to this issue of development, of economic growth, but not only giving special attention to this environmental concerns, that's 1973, but he's also taking into consideration the tendencies of capitalism, including, its destructive tendencies. And then he trying to elaborate and theorize on the options that are available to countries that are, in his view, subject to the kind of a deformation because of this colonial legacy, kind of deformation of, he called the deformation of underdevelopment. So our, the standard economic theory doesn't even look into that. So I think there is this problem as well, how theories come together, what is in the center of these theories. So to sum up here, I guess, in my view, economics has to be concerned with environmental constraints, such as climate change. I think the question also mentioned the issue of a mass extinction of other species. I think, of course, we have to be concerned with that. And there are economists and other social scientists really trying to, doing good research in terms of highlighting how our current system of production and consumption is not sustainable. But in my view, our analysis will carry on failing, having a limit, if you don't face the limited self of our methods in theory, which is the 2 points I was trying to unpack. Okay, let's make something very clear. I do think economists, they should be accountable for their advice. That's 100% sure. We economists, we are in a very privileged position. We learn tools that can help to solve social issues, economic issues. We can assess these issues. So we do what's missing, and that goes back to many things I've been saying up to now, is a training as well regarding how we deal with the consequences of that tools, of these advices. We don't really look into the consequences, because we are stuck in that framework of objectivity, of neutrality, of science, and we think it will be all right. But no, we do need to have a clear discussion about the consequence of the social consequences of our our device when it comes to policy. And for me, that goes back to the issue I mentioned before of this code of ethics that we need. I think this is even more important in a realm such as economics, where is a social science. We're not gonna be able to grasp the truth, the best theory ever, and we still have to advise politicians and policymakers. So I think more than ever, we need to know, to have this kind of ground kind of ethical framework that help us to do that and be accountable for that. So in terms of responsibilities, I think in this context, perhaps I would just mention two responsibilities that I think economists they should have when dealing with, with human beings, with us. One of them I mentioned somehow, which is linked to economics being useful, be concerned with social betterment. And this imply, from my perspective, to avoid relying on methods that underplay inequalities. And inequalities here, I'm talking about inequalities of income, gender, race, and among countries and between countries. And I also think we should avoid relying on framework that underplayed, some of the contradictions that you can see in that system of production and consumption, and contradictions which, by the way, include the entire discussion of climate change, for example. So I think that this is the first responsibility that I think economists they should have, is what is our concern here, what is economics about, in a way. The other kind of responsibility, I think I would say, is a sense of epistemic privilege that economists they have, and they should be aware of it. They should be self-critic to their own privilege that they have when advising, for example, governments and politicians. I think they should have in their mind, they should understand that we should be concerned about different narratives about what's happening in society, different narratives about who we are. This should be kind of prerequisites for any researchers. No, there is no one truth. There are many, and you need to deal with that. And I've been arguing for a very long time now, but more recently I've been very emphatic about that economics, as in any other social theory, is immersed in this kind of pool of implicit but also explicit debate over methodology, different narratives, the issue of structure versus agency. So, when you look into these debates, the history of these debates in social science and economics, we see this myriad of views, interpretations, and different perspectives. So, which goes back to my point that the truth about social reality is basically this, unachievable goal. So here we are dealing with different realities, different objective realities, different cultures, different ways to express them, different methods to study them. And this is not about being subjective and ideological. So economists, they should understand that. That's my self-critic, my point about economists being self-critic vigilance about this. They need to understand these elements, the elements shaping the knowledge they have. They should understand that there are forces shaping this knowledge. They should become realistic about how sometimes there's the narrative you're relying may be just one perspective and may not be the right perspective or the perspective that impacts everybody in the same way. So you need to kind of, for me, the point on be self-critic vigilant as a researcher is key for economists. So I see these two responsibilities really, the social betterment and who we are as a research. We don't hold the truth, and we have to respect different views and approaches, and try our best, really contrasting different explanations and so on. Okay, so how I would define capitalism. So there is, I think, economists, they're often presented, they don't discuss capitalism itself. We just assume that capitalism is about this economic system where we're dealing with private actors, have the question of private property or control of property. And this is happening, so we have our interests and we're dealing with this. So private actors and their property are in this context of, the market contest. You have the supply, the demand setting prices, and then we are interacting through this market. So I think this is how capitalism is superficially defined for every single economist. And I'm not even sure that economists would call this capitalism. They probably say, "Oh, that's just the market." I think I like a deeper discussion about capitalism, because capitalism is one mode of production, is one way to organize production. It hasn't existed for a very long time. If you think in terms of historical time, although there are debates when capitalism really become, assume your full shaped, if it was after, with the industrial revolution or before, or the question of commercial capitalism in the 17th and 16th century. But the question is very recent in history. And there were other modes of production. And in my view, then, when I look into these debates regarding different modes of production and changes, what I see is that a very particular way to organize production under capitalism is to have wage labor, and to have the question of profit and how wage labor and profit relate to with innovation. And this idea that development just happens with innovation, innovations happen with profit, and then we need wage labor. And the theory is trying to bring this together. And in the case of the standard, the modern economics, this discussion, there isn't really a critical approach to that, right? We look into, when you're dealing with the question of distribution in economic theory, you have that each factor of production is remunerated accordingly. That we have the question of marginal productivity of labor, which is, a problem regarding when it comes to understand, in, inequality based on race in our framework, but that's a different discussion. So I think for me, capitalism has this, implies this deep discussion about wage labor, profit, and innovation, and there are different ways to understand that. Now, as economists, we don't discuss that. When you look into our discipline, let's kind of think in terms of the evolution of the discipline itself, right? So that actually has led us to what we have now, which is the mainstream economics. During this process, we have somehow watered down, the historiographical discussion around capitalism. And in doing that, the issues regarding the development of capitalism itself, which involve the question of classes, colonialism, imperialism, we just don't study. We just don't look into that because we're not studying the history of capitalism itself. So because of that, we also have, the way to approach, or the diversity in the discipline regarding different approaches is reduced because you're not really bringing in or considering branches or different or alternatives ways to do economics that are actually considering either imperialism or colonialism key issues to understand capitalism. So we just exclude them because in a traditional account of the discipline, we just water down capitalism. There is a certain naturalization of capitalism. If you talk to a student of economics from Ivy League University or any university around the globe, you see that capitalism is dead. That's in the idea that's the best way of organizing society. But this is not just problematic because we're not teaching our students the proper history of things. It's also because the history of capitalism itself is an endless object of dispute that we're just ignoring. So there are persistent and polemical themes in that debate regarding, for example, the role of technological change, the role of state, the role of classes in the dynamics of capitalism, the relationship between capitalism and European imperialism, how far capitalism is linked to this natural human behavior. All these questions we're not dealing with. So, which is, this is problematic and has consequences. Just to give one example, there are many consequences, but one of them is that this naturalization of capitalism imply to understand that the emergence of capitalism is linked to an idea which goes back to the Enlightenment, the beginning of modernity. This is linked to this period of rationality, this period of technological development. So we're all very proud of ourselves, the Enlightenment. Who is not proud of the Enlightenment? And together with the Enlightenment, you have, the peak of the British Empire, or slave trade, the question of colonialism that's just, as they say, under the carpet, I guess. So, so these questions, they are ignored, they're neglected. So if right now, especially if the events regarding the killing of the Afro-American George Floyd back in March last year, if you want economists to understand that, they just don't have the tools. because we're not dealing with the history of racism, because of this approach, because of this naturalization of capitalism. And I think another important consequence here is that the language of economics that emerge in that context, and that kind of this pride about this that comes of capitalism, is a language that's neutral, that's objective, which I mentioned before. And that language conceals these power imbalances, the structural inequalities we have in society. So we have this claim to objectivity that leads actually to these standardized economic laws that I mentioned before, the question of uniformity. And we just use that for every single social, political, and historical context across the globe. So obviously this is problematic. We exclude other voices, other interpretations, and that's, if you're aiming for a society that's more inclusive, that's fairer, so definitely we need to go back to the history of capitalism itself and try to understand key events, key categories that actually, that's part of capitalism itself. Yeah. Wow. I mean, this is getting the realm of predictions, which is always complicated, especially if it's recorded. uh, well, I think that goes back to my previous answer. Capitalism is one way to organize production, and if we look back into, or if you're trying to learn, different modes of production, the history of these modes of production, the transition between feudalism to capitalism, and other transitions to different modes of production, we understand that there is an aspect of human agency acting, changing that kind of the way we organize society. Capitalism is not, it's not like Fukuyama said in the end of the 80s, 1980s, and it's the end of history. Here we go, that's the best way to organize society, and we are fine. I think it's quite the opposite. I think we have capitalism as in the same way that other modes of production has shortcomings, weaknesses. The problem is we're not assuming them, we're not considering them, we're not looking to these limitations, which in terms of endurance, it goes back to the sustainability of the Earth, the planet itself, but also the question of the inequality among countries, but also among people in one country, right? So we have some let's call contradiction within capitalism, within global capitalism right now, that our current framework is still dealing as something deviating from the norm, from what should be, and not actually dealing with these contradictions as perhaps they are the norms of capitalism. So if we deal, or if you're trying to understand, or at least raise the question, are these contradictions the norm of capitalism? And then we're going to face a serious discussion. We can perhaps move to understand that capitalism is one way to organize society, and perhaps we can start thinking about different ways. We can look back in the past. We know how problematic socialism in the last century was, but that doesn't exclude that we can't go back and review modes of organization that doesn't rely mainly and solely on the market forces. I think there is again, to go back to the kind of economics that has been excluded from the mainstream, feminist economics, for example, is really highlighting a kind of a care economy where you don't really rely on profit motives. There are social scientists theorizing about something called the foundational economy, which is related to, a kind of there's not even the minimal living conditions to anyone. It's like proper living conditions to people. So, but I think when these questions, someone can look into that in terms of tweaks we're going to do to capitalism, but you can also look into that in a way that this system can't survive in a way it is, or perhaps it can't survive. We just have to come up with something differently. And of course, here, you could ask me perhaps the following question would be, well, everybody wants the best. Everybody wants everybody to be happy and have everything, have shiny stuff, or to kind of be able to eat and have shelter and so on. So what's stopping us from either a better system or addressing the weaknesses and shortcomings we have in capitalism itself? And it's difficult to point our finger on someone. Economists with this framework is definitely someone that to go back to accountability, that should be brought into the discussion. But I think there's also something that economics also is not dealing directly, which is the politics of knowledge, but also politics itself in society. Because in our framework, we are really looking into individuals' behavior. The question of classes, social classes, conflict between classes are not really something that economists are really concerned with. It's not part of their framework. So this causes limitations in terms to understand if there is a social class that is gaining from capitalism, therefore want things to keep as it is, because we're not really dealing with that. And social scientists and sociologists that are dealing with that can easily be dismissed as just, a bunch of left ideological scholars. So it's complicated, but I think to summarize, capitalism is not the only system. We can definitely change it. I think the pandemic has really exacerbated some of the contradictions that are inherent to capitalism. And it would be nice to start addressing these contradictions and then have a serious discussion with all the cards on the table about what we're going to do next. We're going to destroy the planet. We're going to live with inequality, with people not having anything to eat, with kids, with children dying of malnutrition. Is that how we want to carry on? I don't think that's the way to carry on, really. Yeah. Emphasize. Yeah, no, I think it goes back to what we've been discussing up to now. I mean, I would say personally, but it's not personally. As an economist, I definitely don't think is the best system to serve the needs of humanity. I really don't think that poverty is, is a failure of the system, is due to market failure or corruption or whatever you want to blame. I think it's how society is organized. I do have analysis of the economy that's based on classes, that consider the question of, I try to understand the question of profit distribution, the question of value, where value is created, how it's distributed. It's something that, again, economists are not really direct concerned anymore. It used to be before. So these questions, actually, as a research, really these questions make me think about the limitations of the system and how poverty can't be eradicated just with policies. It should be eradicated with a different system more than anything else. And I think the difficulty here is, to look back in history and gather elements from social democracy, from socialism, from a period of capitalism where labor and capital, had a better friendship, as they call under the Keynesian demand management. I think it's to look back in all these and gather what's the best, where you have, a moment in history where we are able to deal a little bit more with inequalities in society and among countries. So I think we should go back to this, should review that, and we should also start to be more creative. I think what has happened to economists right now, we are so attached to this word of precision and objectivity. Our tools are so we're relying so much on mathematical deductivism and modeling. We just see ourselves as modelers. And I think we're losing a little bit the poetry of all this. The question of being creative, of being, we have to think about something else, because clearly there are limitations here. So I think this also takes us back to many points I made before, how economists can be more creative with this current framework and methodology. I don't think this is possible. So if you have, if our tools are how can I say, restricted in terms of how we can understand these contradictions, obviously our policy recommendation, our creativity also is going to be, curbed somehow. Is not going to be enough to change society. So yeah, so I do wish we have to finish with Barbara Wooten perhaps. I do think we economists, they should have a concern, a compromise in terms of improving society. And although I think any economist would deny that, I think the problem is they have to look into their framework and see the limitations of their framework in terms of providing to the, to have a economy, or to have a system that is providing to everybody, that is actually serving the needs of humanity as a whole. So yeah, so I think we need to change the way things are definitely not good enough.